Hey y'all, welcome to the channel. I'm an actor, we're on strike, so I'm making reaction videos. Today we're checking out a video from Lost in the Pond by Lawrence Brown. It's called 7 Myths British People Believe About America Part 2. I just did Part 1. Let's check out Part 2. What's up, Lawrence?
Yeah, we're rolling. Hello, this video is sponsored by BritBox, the premier streaming service for Britain's most beloved TV shows. I'm Lawrence Brown and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to myths. Specifically, myths that British people like myself believe about the United States. Real fans of Lost in the Pond will know that I've already done a part 1 in this series, so I will link to that at the end. And if you want to become a real fan and you're not yet subscribed to this channel, do that now.
It's a great idea.
Thanks. You see, after doing part 1 and having lived in the United States for 14 years and 12 days, I realised that there were just lots of falsehoods that I used to believe about the United States of America, thus warranting a second video. And so, without further ado, here are 7 myths that British people believe about the United States, part 2. I used to have this friend when I lived in England who came from a wealthy family.
Everyone owns a swimming pool. That's definitely not true.
I used to have this friend when I lived in England who came from a wealthy family, and it was always the topic of conversation among people whenever we'd speak about this person that they had a swimming pool. And this was very, very unusual for Britain.
Weird.
But American television shows and Jack Black's Instagram page tend to give us this impression that every house in America has its own swimming pool. And this isn't even close to being true, because a lot of Americans I speak to say they can't even afford a swimming pool, but some would say that even if they could, they wouldn't want to put up with the maintenance of it, because you know, it takes a lot to keep that thing clean and
gotta get that pH right,
and clarified and whatever else you have to do to it.
Right.
And most houses I've been to simply don't have one. But I will say this, I think they are slightly more prevalent in the US than they are in Britain. Some houses will have them, some apartment complexes have them. In fact, I lived at one that did, and it was always packed, so I never went in it.
You can road trip the country in a day. I mean, is he saying you can go across the entire country in a day? Because that's not true unless you're on a plane. I've driven across the country once, and it took me 7 days. I think you could do it in 3 or 4.
I talk a lot on this channel about the sheer size of the United States, but there's also something to be said of the slender size of Britain. So growing up there, you very much got used to this idea that you could drive anywhere in the country well within a day, actually within a third of a day. And because Britain becomes the kind of yardstick by which you see the rest of the world,
That's
you sort
crazy.
of assume you can do that in other countries. And for me, the United States was surely no different. So when I visited in 2004,
If there are any Brits watching, how long does it take to drive from, like, London up to the Scottish line?
ex-American girlfriend probably laughed at me when I suggested we do New York, California and the Grand Canyon in a single week. Because it is big, right? One of the shortest routes from the East Coast to the West Coast is Savannah to San Diego. It takes 36 hours by car. Now, if you were to drive this route, which seems unlikely, you might be thinking, it's only a day and a half, we'll bring DVD.
36 hours straight.
Just remember that you have to eat and sleep and go to the toilet and take pictures of yourself over something iconic. You're probably not doing this journey in less than 3 days, so that's more or less half your week gone with just that. And that's the shortest route. If for whatever reason you find yourself driving from Fort Kent, Maine all the way to Seattle, Washington, that's about 50 hours by car, and even then you have to cheat by driving through Canada.
Americans don't watch soccer football. I used to live in Atlanta, and the soccer team there, Atlanta United, was gigantic. They would fill up a stadium. Yeah, soccer's huge. A lot of kids play soccer for school.
I am old enough to remember the 1994 World Cup, and for those of you who don't remember it, it was staged here in the United States. And at the time, I remember a lot of the narrative coming out of the British media was that the United States and its people don't care about football / soccer. But now that I live here, I've discovered that that is still sort of true. But not to the degree I thought it would be. I mean, sure, soccer is still way behind the big four, so NFL, baseball, hockey, and basketball. But whenever I've been into one of those authentic British-style pubs that you find in the United States, and there's a football match on from the Premier League, there's usually quite a lot of people in there, and I know what you're thinking. Ooh, Lawrence, that's just other English immigrants. And that is partly true, but you'll hear a lot of American accents too. And, you know, they'll be bashing the referee along with the rest of us. Not literally, we get a bit rowdy. And here in Chicago, where you have the Chicago Fire, I often meet soccer fans proudly wearing the jersey of Manchester United. And once every 4 years, we have this little thing come around called the World Cup. And if the United States is involved in that...
Is that the World Cup trophy? I don't like it.
As they are at this one, Americans start to take an interest until they lose to England this Friday. The other thing to mention is that soccer is played quite widely in American schools, right? You'll just be driving down the road and you'll be like, oh, there's a goalpost in America, and they're all over the place. And this is because American girls and boys seem to play soccer all the way throughout their education and then just stop. Although some do go on to play professionally, and in the case of the women's team, routinely win the World Cup.
Right. Fun side note, I have an uncle who was a professional soccer player. Americans pronounce words wrong? Well, that's true, but it's part of our culture. We're not trying to do British English. There was a war about that.
Ah yes, that long-held belief that it is in fact Americans who are wrong with their pronunciations. Well, firstly, has anyone ever stopped to consider that maybe none of us are wrong? That there isn't a right way to say aluminium, there are just different ways.
Yes.
And secondly, I constantly get surprised while researching for this channel that American pronunciation of words or spelling of words or just the words themselves are often more in line with the word's origin. Take the word herb, for example, and watch my YouTube short about that very thing. The H, which most Americans drop, was originally silent in French. The way Americans pronounce the L's differently when they say paella is very much in line with how they do it in Spain.
Yes.
Our own British offering of paella isn't. And I could...
Hang on, Brits say paella? If there are any Brits watching, let me know. Americans are rude. We definitely are. We definitely can be. But I think rudeness is a human trait. We're all humans. We all have bad days.
During my life on this planet, I've definitely heard British people make the assertion that Americans are rude. And it's a weird thing because, of course, there are rude Americans. You're never going to get rid of those. But there are rude British people too.
Right.
And rudeness is something you pretty much find everywhere. And I have to say, at least in the Midwest, where I've lived in about 4 different cities now, I don't feel like I've encountered a higher degree of rudeness here than I did in the UK. And on the whole, just like with the UK, most people try to be polite. Actually, if anything, in the UK we have this thing among friends known as banter, in which we call each other names that if I said right now would probably get me demonetized. And you know, in my experience, that banter does spill over into rude territory because sometimes Uncle Toby doesn't know when he's gone too far. So rudeness is sort of relative, and I tend to believe that there are no higher percentage of rude Americans than any other people on Earth.
Thank you, Lawrence. The U.S. doesn't have many accents. That is not true. Northeast accents, different accents all the way down the coast. Florida has different accents. Georgia's accent is different than Texas. It's all different. That is not true.
I think instinctively we all think this about every country on Earth except our own, because we know that our own country represents something of a rich tapestry of dialects. We just sort of become hyper aware of that fact and just assume that nowhere else in the world can say the same thing. And because I grew up in Britain, I was very much attuned to the fact that we had various Yorkshire dialects, Scouse, Mancunian, Geordie, Scottish dialects, Welsh dialects, Irish dialects, Cockney. But I did.
Okay, well, maybe as an American, I thought Brits only had a couple accents. That's a lot.
Didn't have that same awareness of American dialects. To us, there's just 3. There's General American, whatever that is. There's the dialect used by mobsters in films set in New York. And then the South. And that's about it. It was only after I lived here for a few years that I really started to hear quite a lot of differences in the sounds that would come from various parts of just the Midwest. You got the way they speak in Chicago, which is not that. That is my best impersonation. You got the way they speak in Wisconsin, which I'm not even going to try to do. And then the way they speak in Indiana, which sounds closer to Southern in my opinion. And that's just the region I've lived in. You go to the East Coast, there's an absolutely mental amount of differences in the way people say words or the words themselves, especially if you're ordering a sub sandwich. Same in the South, same in the West, same in the Rockies, same in the Pacific Northwest. It's almost a poem, just without the Great Plains. The Great Plains.
I live in California, and people talk like this, like a little bit slower. There's something about it. It's sort of like this. Like, dude. Oh, Bill and Ted. California.
And finally, I've touched on this.
I mean, that's a subjective call, right? Americans don't have a sense of humor? The Brits probably think that because British sense of humor is different than an American sense of humor. I noticed that I've had times in my life where I've frequented around some British people for work. They do a lot of puns. For some reason, Brits think puns are really funny, and I don't think Americans are on that boat as much.
And finally, I've touched on this before, I think that Americans, much like Germans, often get this reputation that they don't have a sense of humour. What we actually mean when we say that is they don't have a British sense of humour. How dare America differ from that in any conceivable way? But they do. They even spell humour differently, which should have been our first clue. One of the chief accusations that you'll hear from the British is that Americans don't understand sarcasm. That to them, the concept of irony is reserved for the nation's industrial workers. That was a joke about iron. But this has never been my experience.
Lawrence, thank you for explaining that.
Long before I moved to the United States, I recognized these very traits in the onion, both the satirical rag and the vegetable, whose comedy doesn't get enough credit for how multi-layered it is. And if you're interested in this subject and you would like a more detailed breakdown on how these differences manifest, then check out my video, 5 Ways British and American Humour is Very Different. But that's it for this episode. Let me know in the comments below some of the myths that you've believed about either Britain or America. I'm Lawrence Brown. You can follow me on Twitter at LostInThePondUS, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel so that I don't have to. Please consider supporting Lost in the Pond on Patreon at patreon.com/LostInThePond.
Great idea.
After all, it's down to my patrons that I'm able to bring you this week's Final Friday special.
Funny video. Thanks, Lawrence Brown and Lost in the Pond. Let me know in the comments below what you think I should react to next. Take care. See you next time. Bye.